Good evening all, and welcome. Big announcement. Well, maybe it won't affect most of you. I'm closing my P.O. box. Why? Well, because I'm moving in a few months, and you have to buy a 6-month subscription, so there doesn't really seem to be any point to keep it. Thank you to everyone who sent me stuff in the past. I really appreciate it. And if you've been thinking of sending me something, you better get in there quick, because it's going to disappear in 3 weeks and I'll never get it. But anyway, for now guys, it's time for you all to get comfortable. Get your black robes ready, and let the darkness take control. I was hunting with a friend of mine, Tom, deep in the mountains of North Carolina. We went to the top of a ridge to get a good look at the area and try to pick a likely place to find some pigs. I saw a dirt road to the east, a fire trail actually, and was about to write it off when I noticed a row of campers driving along it. They disappeared behind a hill at the edge of the valley. I scanned the valley floor and found several other campers near the tree line. Tom suggested we go over to see if they would share a meal and a warm fire with 2 worn-out hunters. It was dark by the time we got over the hill, and they disappeared behind, so we climbed up to get a good last bearing and a distance estimate, and what we found was surreal. About a half a mile away, in the middle of the clearing, was a bonfire. Instinctively, we both dropped to the ground and crawled for some brush for cover overlooking the valley. I scanned the area looking for the camp and any security they might deploy. Tom surveyed the other side of the valley. When he grabbed my arm, I turned and followed his gaze. There were 2 groups of people standing near the edge of the valley right below us. One was wearing black hoods and robes, the other white. A figure carrying a staff was wearing a red hooded robe, walked out of the trees towards the fire, and the others followed in 2 single file lines. At the fire, the red figure stopped and raised his arm. The black robes circled clockwise, and the white robes counterclockwise, until they completely encircled the fire, alternating black and white. We could hear chanting, but we couldn't make out words. After about an hour of chanting and walking about the fire, first in one direction, then in the other, they stopped, and a naked man was brought out from the tree line, bound and blindfolded. He was presented to each of the robed figures clockwise around the fire, before being presented to the figure in red. He was then made to lie down at the red figure's feet. Then, a naked bound woman was brought out, and the process was repeated counterclockwise before she was laid next to the naked man. I, at least, had no idea what I was watching or what I should do. There was more chanting and then silence as 4 black-robed figures emerged from the tree line, carrying a black robe much like a flag. They circled the flag clockwise, once behind the figures and once in front of them. Each black figure touched the robe as it passed. When they arrived at the red figure, they stopped over the naked man. The red figure said something, and the other responded. He then pointed his staff at the naked man, and the 4 laid the robe on top of him. Another chant, and a white robe was brought out, and the process was repeated, counterclockwise, stopping over the naked woman. The red figure said something, and the other responded. He then pointed his staff at the naked woman, and all 4 laid a robe over her. The red figure waved his hand and staff over them, and raised the staff over his head. The robe bearer then picked up the robes as they had before, and the 2 rose from the ground. The robe bearers then lifted the robes over their heads, and the 2 then circled the fire twice, embracing each member. First the robes of their colour, and then the other. When they got back to the red figure, He pointed towards the camp with his staff, and the new members led the procession back to camp. I watched them enter the tree line, then looked back to the fire for the red figure. He hadn't moved. When the last couple was out of the clearing, the bonfire flashed green, then red, and the red robe collapsed on the ground. We humped all the way back to our truck that night. We were too scared to stop. The next morning we stopped at a Denny's for breakfast. We had put out more than 60 miles between us and that clearing and felt safe. While we were eating, two couples came in. One sat behind Tom and the other behind me, so that each of us saw them. They just smiled at us while we ate. When we left, we saw two campers in the parking lot. Tom and I never spoke about that night, and we found a better hunting area far away from that clearing. It's been nearly 40 years since that night, and every once in a while, I come across a couple in a camper, and they just smile at me. Me and a couple of friends live at the very edge of our neighborhood, the edge of town, and behind our houses is a seemingly endless sea of forest. I kid you not. I've walked for hours in several directions and never reached the end. On Google Maps, it may as well be a state park. Anyway, we have explored these forests countless times, and in our minds were always incredibly safe places to walk along. Some people took their dogs, other people liked to ride their bikes, others liked to hike. Everyone in the area knew this was the place to be if you wanted to go for a long walk, especially us. One afternoon, we had taken our paintball guns and gone out for a massive session down in the woods. There was a part that was quite remote, that we knew very well and often played at. This was our first time there in a few months, and after we'd finished our session, we were cooling off with a drink before making our way back, when we noticed something peculiar on the ground. It was ash, candles, and the remains of some papers. Whoever was here had left candles that had almost fully run out of wax, and just left the small little metallic containers on the ground. We looked around, quite confused. It didn't look very old, as it hadn't been covered in leaves yet, as this was the fall. We assumed this must have been only a few days old. My friends and I joked that it must be the local Satan worshippers, despite the fact that we knew nothing of the sort existed in our area. One of us then said that we should have a stakeout and see if they come back in the middle of the night. We all laughed and dismissed it, and went back home and kind of forgot about it. Well, a few months later, in the news, dogs and cats started disappearing. Our town paper was full of these reports that there were these serial pet abductors on the loose. No one really knew what was going on. Now that you're listening, you've probably pieced it together. And yep, that is exactly what happened. You heard me. It was the people, cult, Satanists, whatever you want to call them, that would meet near where we played paintball in the woods, that would take these pets and kill them. I'm not really sure what they did. I don't like to know the details. But one day, when we decided it would be time for another round of paintball, this was already about May, did we go over to our regular place and see that it had changed significantly. There were now plastic chairs, as well as a much bigger fire pit for whatever rituals they were trying to do, as well as some fresh mounds of dirt scattered along the side. Some looked like they had been trampled. We were worried and called the cops. They took a long time to get out because we were now very remote, and I heard back later that they had found the cadavers and skeletons and charred remains of pets. These cult members had taken these pets, abducted them from front lawns or whatever, and set them on fire, or slit their throats and used their blood. This is just speculation now. I truly don't know what went on, as I was spared the details. But it certainly creeped us out. Safe to say, we strayed from those woods for a while, and we found another place to play paintball. I think it's better that way. I don't think they ever caught the cultists. Maybe we should have done that stakeout after all. I've always had an interest in hauntings and magical practices since I was a child. My parents were rigid Catholics, so it was not due to any positive exposure. It's been in my nature never to accept what folks tell me offhand, and to find out for myself. That it was forbidden only whetted the interest. I pursued this academically as an adult, and received a Master of Arts in Western Esotericism from the University of Exeter back in 2011. However, my goal in studying ecstatic and visionary experiences from the measurable views provided in biology and physics. My story starts when my wife and I had returned from teaching in Japan for 2 years, and prior to the start of my studies. At the time, I was working a temp job, where I was paid to do next to nothing. I think I worked a solid 3 days out of every month, without exaggeration. I had a lot of time to waste. The other guy I worked with has been a journalist for the Houston Chronicle, who had fallen on hard times later in life. The man had stories, though he had an odd fascination with Bigfoot. The one in particular that piqued my interest was his account of a local stretch of road the locals called Spook Road. He regaled me with a story he had heard from a friend who was a park ranger. His friend had apparently observed a group of black hooded figures marching in procession through a cornfield to an abandoned barn off the road. One odd characteristic of this haunting is that it's not simply attached to one event, but numerous stories range from suicides, the murders at the Gitche-Montu State Reserve just south of the road, the natives that still perform their ceremonies there, and practitioners of black magic carrying out rituals there. It's a happening place that has been for the span of memories for everyone in the area. Fast forward to when I had begun my studies and was piecing together my dissertation topic. I was considering John Dee's Enochian practices, which I won't go into here, but one interesting detail is that Anton LaVey's Church of Satan made use of Dee's rituals only filling off the serial numbers and replacing satanic references where Dee made reference to God. I was working at Jimmy John's, where I opened what became the freakiest, fastest Jimmy John's in the franchise. The first 4 hours of my shift were alone, and gave me time to plan my papers, while I went about the rote procedure of cutting vegetables, breaking bread, and prepping the cold tables. I was telling my co-workers that I was studying LaVey's satanic rituals, and one of my co-workers, who was usually quiet and a bit zoned out, maybe it was too much weed, as Jimmy John's had no drug testing, so it was pretty common, perked up at the mention of this. He asked me what I knew about Satanism, and I shrugged and stated that Satanism was about as dangerous and evil as a fart in a crowded elevator. He seemed put out at this, and ended the conversation. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I asked him what it was he wanted to discuss. His stories were disturbing. He stated that there was a group of Satanists that were prevalent in this area. I will be blunt. He claimed that this group kidnapped and murdered folks, and even went about rituals of secretly birthing children in their group for sacrifice. Now, I take ethics rather seriously, and had just had my first son. I felt ill. But what was interesting is that I had a very odd feeling as he was telling me this. I had the very distinct sensation I was being watched. I had told the co-worker about the black hooded figures on Spook Road, and this made his eyes go wide. He stated that this rather disreputable group were connected to the road thanks to its history and its connection to the supernatural. Apparently he went out to Spook Road rather frequently and had a large number of odd experiences. On one trip, he had gone down the road uneventfully, but upon the return of it, the entire road had changed completely, with houses that shouldn't have been there. On another occasion, he had gone out of the road and didn't feel himself. They stopped at a gas station, and when he went to wash his face, when he looked up into the mirror, his face was not his own. While hiking nearby, he also claimed to have run into odd folk who had odd characteristics where everything they suggested sounded like a good idea, and he felt compelled to agree. I asked him how he'd heard about this group. Having this been purely of his fabrication was a clear possibility. A woman who was, to him, like a surrogate mother, claimed to have been a part of the group, but had gotten out of it after it proved too much for her. However, she stated that she was still stalked by them, and that apparently these folk had the ability to leave their bodies and follow you, which I informed him was typically called astral projection, and could also enter your dreams. This made the sensation of being watched boil over in terror for me. I instantly felt physically cold, and my stomach twisted in knots. What's more, while apparently the abandoned barn they practiced at off the road had burnt down, he believed that they were using the one north of town. The angle of my studies to this point were merely an interest. I held that essentially reality was wholly based on perception, and that there could be nothing to alter it. The notion of these folks having the capacity to alter a person's perceptions, and also the possibility of people willing to murder others so close to home, if any of this were true, kept me up at night, completely unable to close my eyes. My brother is a well-established psychologist who was finishing his PhD at the time, and he is by far the more grounded of the two of us. I decided I needed to talk to him, to get this nonsense that was keeping me up at night out of my head. I shared all the stories I had heard up until this point, only to him have me cut me off and finish my story in greater detail, though he admitted he had heard of no barn, including human sacrifices. He then asked me if I was familiar with a grimoire called the Grimorium Verum. For him to be conversant on something that I'd not heard of in my own studies caught me off guard. I now own a copy of this book, and it's very frankly grisly in its methods, and aims to rather openly centered on summoning Lucifer and his lieutenants. He then stated this book was apparently the key to their practice. I asked him how it's possible he knew about any of this. He stated he was looking into it, because one of his patients at the moment claimed to be a victim of this very same group, and was afflicted with odd forms of dissociative identity disorder, where his alter ego identified itself as a demon. He surmised it had come from a result of his traumatic experience. My brother then went on to say his fellow staff warned him that this group of people were terribly active, and would come in at times posing to be victims. He was cautioned to carefully monitor their symptoms for a lapse in the act. This was all too much for either of us, and following this discussion, we did not talk again for months. We both, unbeknownst to the other, simultaneously had been looking at the same phenomena and had each verified each other's findings and fears. He left that counseling group shortly after and focused on helping kids in deeply troubled households. I did what any mature person would do upon realizing his fears could be very real. I went out to their purported place of practice and all associated locales. I'm nothing if not consistent, and do not accept what is told to me. I always look into it directly myself. So I decided to have a look at all of the areas connected to Spook Road. The barn where these people were purported to practice, the road itself, which my co-worker claimed the group had bound a demon to protect them, and the Gitche Manteau State Reserve, just south of the road. Our co-worker warned me that we should not stay there longer than 6 p.m. on recommendation from the woman who claimed to be a former member. Fine with me. I'd rather have a look when the sun's up. As I have said previously, I am willing to directly investigate all of the occult, paranormal, and supernatural. But I am also deathly afraid of it all, but also exhilarated. My father claims I have a very special kind of stupid, and I am compelled to agree. It was late fall, and while it was bearable, over 30 degrees during the day with a jacket, once the sun went down, it was rather cold. We started off by heading off to the barn north of town. I was immediately underwhelmed. It was definitely an old, rundown barn. My co-worker pointed out pieces of twine that were hanging off posts, and took the time to display that they could be used to tie someone up. I quirked an eyebrow, and was rather convinced this kid was caught up in it all, and was seeing what he wanted to see. I still hold that opinion. We then went up to the loft. Squatters stayed here frequently for sure. Socks, underwear, sleeping bags and shirts were all over. I noticed some satanic graffiti, but assumed that folks all came here having heard such stories and had left their mark. I took a step to the left, right next to where a sleeping bag was, and immediately fell through the floor. I managed to catch myself on the support beams and calmly hoisted myself out. I'm a rock climber amongst other things, and nearly falling is no new thing. I only cursed myself that I had managed to injure myself and burden my wife, who was already adjusting to our first little one over something so broadly ridiculous as a ghost hunt. I deserve whatever was coming to me. We all noted the oddity after that, though most of the floor was too rotten to walk on. Why was a sleeping bag right on it? Also, half of the floor we were walking on had been very recently remade. If a squatter had tried to get in with that sleeping bag, they'd have fallen right through. Puzzling to be sure, but I never got to go back and confirm it at all. As the summer following our exploration, the barn was burnt down in an act of arson that was never solved. This seems an apt time to point out that my co-worker averred that there was a conspiracy afoot as well. He claimed political officials and police were part of this group. Again, I was compelled to think this was him seeing what he wanted to see, but what happened next brought that into question. We headed over to Spook Road proper. The road had a creek that snakes through in 5 places, meaning 5 bridges. One of the old stories is that when you go across the road one way, you cross 5 bridges, but as you head back, you only cross 4. This, to me, plays on the dull wits of those who turn around on the last bridge and forget to count it. Anyway, there's a cemetery on the final bridge where my co-worker claimed a demon was bound. As we parked on the side of the road near the 4th bridge and walked to the 5th, we spotted a sheriff coming down the road. The 3rd fellow we brought along thought it would be funny to hide behind a tree as he passed. The sheriff thought otherwise and stopped his car and got out. He asked us what we were doing. Previous this, the other two wouldn't stop yammering on, but now their tongues had stopped working. I told the sheriff we were out for a hike and pointed to the nearby hiking path. "Why did your friend hide behind a tree when he saw me?" I fought the urge to glare at the dumb kid for doing that, but instead said, "He's an idiot," and thought it would be funny to hide from the cops due to stereotypes. That worked. Just don't cause any trouble. Why on earth was a sheriff patrolling a dead stretch of road no one was on? No cars, no people, just us. And we'd only been on it for minutes and had caused no ruckus. We moved onto the cemetery. As we stepped up, suddenly my guts lurched. I felt ill and dizzy. This struck me as odd, because I'd just fallen through the floor without issue, but a dinky cemetery was giving me the shivers? Then the co-worker told me why he claimed this road was bound with a demon. This is where they bury the infants. We walked through to find a felled tree that had been cut up but left there. This is where it gets odd. There was a full can of lighter fluid next to it, and there was very clearly a path down into the bracken. I couldn't make my feet move. I was completely rooted in terror and had no idea why. My co-worker went down and asked me to come down. I couldn't. I looked to our 3rd, but saw, despite his loud claims of atheism and that this was all crap, that he couldn't move either. Why was there a full can of lighter fluid? Fallen trees are terribly cheap to haul away. Why hadn't this been done? We later looked at the history of the cemetery via Google Earth and saw that the tree had been cut down and laid there for years. I'd had enough and said we should leave. The sun was going down at this point. My co-worker said he wanted to show me Gitchi Mantu first, and I agreed, stating we make it quick. It was really cold now, and we could see our breath. My leather jacket was no longer cutting it, and my hands were freezing even with gloves. My co-worker told us about the murders that had taken place here, but the terror in my guts was now gone, and I was unimpressed. At this point, I was using the walk to get my nerves back in order. My co-worker claimed he had seen a black shadow following us, but I rolled my eyes. I had the feeling he was trying to jazz himself up, because he enjoyed this sort of thing way too much. He then showed us a pond that was actually eerily still, which, while neat, had nothing to do with anything. It was when I noticed voices and saw flashlights shining through the pond. I then joked that maybe they were after us. I'm not kidding you. The voices stopped, and the flashlights whipped in our direction. The chase was then on. As we were running back to the car, we ran out of breath near the end and walked as fast as we could to the parking lot to see a tan truck parked next to us with binoculars on the dash. It was nearly winter, nearly dark, freezing cold, and not another soul in sight. Why the heck were these people out here, and why did they chase us? After that, I've had the worst nightmare I've ever had, and to this day, I swear it to be, as I state it here, someone else was in my dream. I've dreamt that my wife and I were staying at a haunted hotel, but then the dream suddenly stopped, and a man clipped through the floor. Only the upper part of his face would be seen through the floor, and he locked eyes with me. I then was jackknifed awake, and the words were audible in my head as I sat up in my bed shaking. "We are watching you." I am quite aware of my mental faculties, and this was not merely my nerves. I am very convinced someone else was in my dream. The research of the Stanley Cripper, Montague Ullman et al. In the books Dream Telepathy, perhaps the only viable scientific study on the phenomenon, goes a ways towards confirming this is possible. I have only once been terrified as much as that moment. We just moved all the way from the West Coast to the Midwest. We had trouble finding a place to stay since we had such a huge family. So one of our uncles let us stay in the other half of his duplex. It was a 2-story giant house. Anyway, we were the kids, playing in the basement at 1 or 2 a.m. and we see this door that we had never noticed before. We dared each other to try and open it, but no one would, since we were all scared. The next morning, we told my grandfather about the room. He goes into the basement and opens up the door, which was just a small room. But I remember it being really dark in there. The only light that came into the room were the small amounts of light from us opening the door. He takes a look into the room, and I remember him saying, "You stay right here." Not talking to me, of course. He got my father and then quickly went to the farmer's and got a chicken. My grandfather was a traditional shaman, so he respectfully gave thanks to the chicken and killed it. The chicken blood was collected into a bowl. He got the shaman hat and finger bells. He put on the hat, which covered his entire face, and proceeded to open the door. With the finger bells in one hand and the bowl of chicken blood, he goes in there and says some incantation and places the chicken blood in the room. He comes out, closes the door, and then he starts doing his chants, and you can hear the bowl moving. It had this spinning kind of sound to it, and when it finally stops, my grandfather opens the door again. As his chants get louder, it also echoes more. We weren't allowed to see what was happening in that room during the exchange, but his finger bells sounded like he was walking into a corner. He comes out with the bowl that had a small amount of chicken blood left, and what looked to be a little hand-stitched doll with red twine around it in the blood-soaked bowl. I remember clearly the little doll was soaked in blood. He takes a match and lights the doll on fire in the bowl. He tells my father to make sure to bring it outside and don't let the fire die out until he gets outside. I don't know how the bowl with the chicken blood was on fire. I doubt chicken blood would catch on fire, so the only thing I could think of was the doll. Once my father left, I got a look into the room, and you can faintly see that most of the chicken blood is splattered around the room. We had to clean it up later with flashlights because the room was so dark and the blood was smeared all over the walls. A few days later, in the middle of the night, I hear my mother and father panicking. There was a ton of smoke in the house. We went out of the room to check out what was happening, and my father was running back and forth from the bathroom to get the pail of water to where the smoke was coming from. My mother grabbed all of us outside and called the fire department. We all got outside except my grandfather, who was nowhere to be found. My dad quickly ran back into the duplex, and for what seemed like hours, came out carrying my grandfather on his back. Somehow, my grandfather had his shaman hat on, which puzzled me. I asked my father a few years ago, after grandfather had passed away, about where he'd found him. My dad said the smoke was coming from near the basement. He found my grandfather in a deep trance facing a wall. He quickly got my grandfather out of the trance and carried him out. It was weird, since the firefighters said the fire must have suffocated itself to death because they couldn't find a fire at all. However, the walls in the kitchen and in the basement were all smoked afterwards. My father said a bad spirit was trapped in the room. My grandfather is the only one that knows why it was trapped in there, so I can't tell you why it happened. Was the ritual necessary? My grandfather would never do rituals unless he had to. It's been very tiring on the ancestral spirits and the body to keep doing rituals. He wouldn't do one unless he knew he had to. Spirits like these don't just go away naturally. Even today, if I were feeling ill, a shaman would most likely tell me to seek medical attention, unless my soul were missing or wounded. There's a big difference in being physically sick and having your soul wounded or missing. I was in 7th or 8th grade when me and about 15 of my friends and acquaintances went into the woods by the highway. To ensure that no one saw that there were kids with airsoft guns and camos shooting each other, we trekked deep into the woods. No highway car could be heard, so we knew it was far enough. We eventually came across this old single-roomed house. The windows were boarded up with wood, and the door had about 5 padlocks, and the pool out the back was green with algae. Grass overgrew any remnants of a driveway through the dense forest. Peeking through the wood boards, we found broken furniture and the floor caked in dirt. The guy who organized the hangout lived nearby and assured us that the owners hadn't been at the house for 10 years. They were old and presumed dead. With no concerns, we finally played airsoft for a few hours. Needing a break, we rendezvoused back at the house. As we approached, we could hear this faint sound of an engine. Nobody could even tell the car was approaching at first because of the thick brush. Sure enough, a black car was rolling around the corner. Pulling up to our group, the driver lowers the passenger window. An old man driving an old man behind him. The passenger was an elderly woman with another elderly woman behind her. Everyone in the car was dressed in all black formal clothes. They practically started screaming at us to get away, literally almost shrieking, but it also sounded angry. We tried to apologize for trespassing, but the driver started reaching for something in the glove box and we all ran out of there. Their eyes were so greyish blue, it was almost transparent. Their hair was whiter than snow. The black tuxedos and dresses were vampiric looking. To this day, I think they were cultists. I'll never know, and I shall never forget. I grew up in your basic non-denominational Christian household, both parents being devout, but not overly obsessive, so this is where things took a turn. My dad brought my older brother and I to this evening church service at a new location. I remember thinking it odd, even at the age of 7, that this church was being held in a dimly lit single-floor office complex. On arrival, my father brought us forward to meet the pastor and have him pray over us. This man stood over my brother and I, laid his hand on our head, and started speaking in tongues. I know some sects of Christianity do this. Yet, while he would do so, the whole room of men and women began to do the same, some falling on the floor in seizure-like fits. When the pastor finished his chanting, he spoke to my father and told him that he saw our future from God, and if we remained loyal, we would do whatever we wished. He then condemned us from having any toys, because now that we have been seen by God, the devil would use our toys to carry demons. That night, my dad threw away all of our toys and told us how he saw a man's face turn lizard that night, and we must rid ourselves of demons. The only thing that saved my brother and I from going back was my mother hearing this and forbidding us from ever visiting again. Though my parents separated, I do believe my father returned numerous times to this church, yet he now lives in a home, doped up on many mind-numbing medications. I lived in a very quiet rural town when I was younger. There was only one stoplight, a Safeway, and one gas station, with little mom and pop shops in between. I lived 35 minutes out of town on a street with only 5 other people on it, all a good walking distance away from each other, meaning you couldn't see your neighbours out your window. It was only 10 or 12 at the time, and my older brother, who had recently got his license, wanted any excuse to take the car out, and me being an annoying little sister, always begged to tag along. I can't remember what we had done, but it was 11:30 at night, and we had just turned on our long winding street. I lived in the Pacific Northwest, so the pine trees tower over you, and can sometimes give you the feeling of being enclosed, and it was a particularly foggy night, so visibility was limited. I was looking towards my brother from the passenger seat, not paying attention to the road at all, when all of a sudden, my brother slams on his brakes hard enough that I nearly hit the dashboard. I had my mouth open, about to yell at him, when I see his face is petrified, with an expression I couldn't pinpoint. His lips were pinched together, nostrils flaring, and I could hear his breathing. His eyes wide open and locked on like a missile to its target. I finally allow my eyes to follow his gaze. In the middle of the street, low fog on the road, were 2 individuals in black robes with their hoodies on. These robes were the real thing, just like the Grim Reaper's, wider at the opening of the sleeves, and the hood completely covered their faces, so we couldn't see anything. We sit there for what felt like forever, just staring at them in our headlights, and then they start to walk towards us. At this point, my scared shitless little self had both hands on my brother's, shaking his arms violently, back and forth, screaming. "Lock the doors, lock the doors!" he cried out. I am! And pressing the lock button, we hear the reassuring sound. These people were crawling towards the car, in perfect sync, stepping slowly at the same time. We watched them as they made their way to the front of the car, and then make the slight turn so they began walking by the driver's side. My brother and I were stuck in fear, just staring as they walked past us and disappeared into the dark of our rearview mirror. We sped home and freaked out, telling our dad everything, who then called the cops, who reported multiple sightings of these 2 and then instructed us not to confront them. We never heard or saw anything about them again, but creepy cult members, I hope we do not meet again. I visited a friend in Miami back in the 80s. There were 3 of us, and we decided to drop acid and go for a hike in the swamp. We saw many wonderful and strange things, like banana spiders, huge things with massive webs, almost walked face first into one, and all kinds of animals. We reached this quiet part of the swamp, where it was darker, and the ground was hard-packed black mud, with little holes filled with swamp water. There was a clearing in the mud, and a long black wooden dock was built on top of the mud, which ended in like a wooden deck/altar setup. The whole dock was painted in strange white symbols or runes. We were climbing around on it, just trying to convince ourselves that it was real. Silently, out the swamp, about 3 dozen raccoons wandered towards us, completely unafraid. They were dipping their hands in the holes, I guess searching for food. They surrounded us on the dock and passed around and under us in about 10 minutes. There was a lot. They looked at us curiously and kept on moving. I walked to the entrance of the docks and turned around, looking down the dock at exactly the right angle. The white paint symbols connected in perspective of the railing, slates, and wooden decks of the dock to form a huge satanic goat head, the kind you might find in a book of the occult. I showed my buddies, and we got real quiet and moved away from the area. We spent the rest of the trip on the beach surrounded by people and life. I have no idea what the dock was for, and I'm not sure I want to know. I grew up on Guam and attended Harvest Christian Academy, Baptist, from kinder till middle school. My goodness, it was hell. At the time I couldn't see it because I was so brainwashed, but the whole school community was a cult. They brainwashed and forced Christianity onto students constantly, and if you didn't convert, you were segregated from the community. As a Christian school, I would understand that you would want to influence students to your religion, but no way should students feel left out because they have their own set of beliefs. Other really odd things they made me believe was wearing too short of a skirt or shorts was sinful and ungodly, because we were allowing Satan to control our body, to manipulate the mind of our peers. They even made us believe that watching movies that were not rated PG are sinful, and I should stay away from them. Pop culture and music was also not accepted and were banned ungodly. They went as far as saying that students, mind you I was in kindergarten when this rule was enacted, can't bring items with characters such as Pokemon, Powerpuff Girls and Harry Potter, because they are depicted with superpowers that only God can have, and thus it is unholy. The hardest thing to do was finally growing up and realizing how much bullshit was being fed to me and begging my parents to get me the hell out of there. After leaving, I faced repercussions of old friends turning their backs on me and teachers looking down and shaming me. Overall, it was a terrible, terrible situation, and I'm so glad I left that place to experience a better high school. Sad thing is that most of my friends I grew up with that graduated from that school still hold the same outlook on life and are still very much involved in the school and its community. I went turkey hunting with my dad in the Shawnee National Forest several years ago. I was about 10. We took one afternoon to hike and scout hunting spots. Along the trail, we saw a few blood spatters and drips. Not a big deal, it's nature. About a quarter of a mile up the trail, however, we come up to 3 dogs hanging from a tree, gutted, bled out, and skinned. Okay. Now that was pretty weird and scary. We keep going a bit further, as there was a bluff not too far away that was pretty cool to look at. We come to the bluff and find weird symbols burned in the ground and on the side of the rock wall. Candle wax, absolutely everywhere, and more blood all over the ground. By that time my dad, whom I've never seen scared in my life, looked at me and said, "Let's go," and we took off at a pretty big pace back to the camp. The worst part is that we didn't leave the campsite that night, so I laid awake in the camper freaking out at every sound I heard. I still get goosebumps thinking about that event to this day. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. You know, I found this video quite refreshing. The cult stories weren't all about horrific religious experiences. They were a lot darker. I'm gonna be honest, I got really excited reading the one about the guy in the red robe that disappeared. Man, that was probably my favourite story. Which one was yours? Be sure to leave me a comment down below. And no, we don't have to get to 1,000 again, but comments are always welcomed and appreciated. If you liked the video, don't forget to drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you're new here, subscribe and press the bell icon to be notified for your nightly spooks. Also, this was only selected because of a poll I put out. I hope cult stories weren't overtaken at the last minute by something else. That would have been embarrassing. But yeah, I really like putting these polls out. But quick questions. Some of you guys have been saying about aliens and alien stories. Do you guys want that in a future video? Because the last time I did an alien video, it performed really badly. So I'm not sure if you guys are super interested in alien encounters. That'd be something I really would like to see in the comments section, either a yes to aliens or no to aliens. And every time it's in a poll, it will always lose. So yeah, let me know and maybe I'll put an alien video out soon. Or maybe not, it just really depends on your feedback. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.